First Contract, Act 1. Diplomatic Mission. Fleet Admiral Kindrel was still unsure about the purpose of their current mission. He glanced at his tablet and wiped his forehead with his left paw. The stress from this diplomatic endeavor had been significant, affecting his sleep. Ambassador Marcus, a seasoned human diplomat, chuckled as he picked up his own tablet. Over the past decade, Marcus had led numerous missions, successfully negotiating treaties with half a dozen alien species. The deep wrinkles around his eyes gave him the appearance of a wise, old turtle, especially when he smiled. Known for his cheerful disposition, Marcus had a knack for finding clever solutions when others had given up. Kindrel took another sip of his decaf coffee, a beverage originating from Earth that had become popular among the Tari officers, replacing the traditional bitter herb tea they had consumed for centuries. Despite being mildly toxic to them due to residual caffeine, decaf coffee had a calming and slightly psychedelic effect on Tari officers and politicians, who were now microdosing it. This new trend coincided with a renaissance in arts and social progress among the Tari, though Kindrel couldn't care less about the arts. He tucked his deep blue officer's shirt into his trousers and adjusted his tie, which was uncomfortably tight. Human garments had become widely adopted among the Tari, and even the proudest warriors now don Trini samurai attire. Despite the cultural blending and the exchange of disruptive ideas between the two species, Kindrel often found humans puzzling. Ambassador Marcus, ever cheerful, turned his swivel chair around and scooted closer to Kindrel, the chair creaking and squeaking as it moved. Marcus often joked that he was riding a big mouse, though the Tari lacked a well-developed sense of humor. Perhaps more decaf coffee could change that. "Don't worry, my dear friend," Marcus said reassuringly. "We can go through the whole protocol again." Kindrel stood still, his head moving slowly from side to side. "Oh gosh, I hope he's not having a decaf overdose again," thought Marcus. Okay, so when the Galactic Union reached out to Earth in 2071, on the day we now call First Contact Day, how unoriginal, the United Nations of Earth signed a multitude of treaties. It was human diplomacy's finest hour, as we managed to make the treaties binding even for nations that are not technically members of the UN. Yes, even North Korea, the Marie Byrd Land Commune, and Kurdistan were forcibly included in the treaties. Kindrel stopped moving his head and relaxed his whiskers. "Yes, Marcus, and that never ceases to amaze me. How humans are so reluctant to unite, yet they can rally and speak with one voice when it matters most. We're not as unified as the Tari," Marcus admitted, "but you guys have had a planet-wide civilization and a history without any discontinuity for millennia. Your warring clans and civil wars are a distant memory today. But whatever happened to your original languages and dialects? They were all abandoned, and ancient books were translated into the common language when we proceeded with the Great Tari unification. There is always something lost in translation, my dear Kindrel. A sparkle, a soul," said Marcus with an enigmatic smile. "So yeah, humans are still split along linguistic, religious, and ideological lines, despite the UN acting as some kind of umbrella organization for galactic diplomacy. The universal translator glitched and translated umbrella as large hat for rain. Humans had an endless supply of rarely used words and often spoke in metaphors. Kindrel still understood the point. He had been working with humans for 12 years and had an extensive understanding of their culture, traditions, and language quirks. He gazed out the ship's large window, barely making out the brown dwarf star they were orbiting, a dark, ominous disk against the starry background. The room fell silent for a few minutes. Marcus walked to the window and stared at the distant nebulas and star clusters. As you might know, humans tend to be a little. In the chaotic environment of competing interests, the two most influential Earth-based corporations managed to persuade the United Nations to permit the establishment of private space colonies. These corporations, having their own private space programs and far greater wealth than most Earth nations, were well positioned to do so. This information was included in the diplomatic mission file that Falser was supposed to have read. Falser rolled his eyes and said, "Yes, we have visited the private Earth colony of Musia once. It's a bleak, rocky planet around Antares, but their underground city is stunning, and they grow some nice vegetables. The colony is overseen by a pompous male human who holds the title of CEO. He is heavily tattooed and pierced, and goes by the bizarre name XAA-12. Despite this, Musia is not a fully independent human colony. It has chosen to remain under the jurisdiction of the United States of America, a member of the United Nations. True, Jasper, Falser continued. But what's the deal with the human colony around the brown dwarf Lumen 16b, which they've renamed Happy? Who would name a star system Happy? Nonetheless, the people of Happy have decided to withdraw unilaterally from the United Nations, placing themselves in a diplomatic void. They are no longer members of the Galactic Union, and all bilateral treaties between the UN and other entities, such as the Kishtar fleet, no longer apply to them. It is suspected that this maneuver was to negotiate a more profitable deal with us. Falser rolled his eyes again. Can't we just ignore them? They're run by a rich corporation, but they can't be that significant in human galactic endeavors. Jasper carefully put the tablet back on the meeting room table and gazed at the stars for a few moments before speaking with a tired smile. I suspect you haven't read the file, dear Falser. The colony on Happy owns thousands of patents and a massive amount of intellectual property, ranging from industrial processes to cultural products. They are a powerhouse in FTL communication and the sole provider of plasma bolt weapons for our entire fleet. They're also a major contractor for the joint human Kishtar dogfighter development program. Without them, we're screwed. Falser massaged his forehead with his paw, feeling increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. He used to be a fleet admiral and a fine strategist, but since humans had entered the scene, his role had become more diplomatic, a role that gave him headaches, especially when human factions were involved. Act 2. Lawyers. The human Kishtar ship CFS Juno was now in orbit around the brown dwarf's only planet, a desolate world without an atmosphere. The icy surface was uniformly red-brown and very dark, with only a few peaks illuminated by the dim light of the brown dwarf star. At the southern pole, Jasper could see an expansive constellation of bright white spots connected by dotted orange lines. This was the planet's main settlement, home to 500,000 humans. The corporate headquarters stood out at the center of the spiderweb-like settlement, a tall spire resembling a funky postmodern version of a medieval tower. They chose a world no other race claimed. Not even the UN star charts listed as inhabitable since it has no intrinsic value. Its only advantage is that its gravity is 80% of Earth's. Without their imported fusion reactors, the inhabitants would freeze to death, Falser noted, shaking his head in agreement. Carrie, don't settle on brown dwarf worlds. They're not worth the trouble. We once considered building secret shipyards on rogue planets, but the strategist who proposed that idea got fired, literally. Unfortunately, he just lost his job. The delegation from the Happy System settlement will arrive shortly. They're sending their lawyers ahead of time to negotiate the trilateral treaty. They've refused all our preliminary clauses and insist on negotiating on their terms, Jasper explained. Falser looked as if he was about to choke. Lawyers? Human lawyers are feared across the whole quadrant. But don't worry, we anticipated their move. We've hired the best lawyers we could find on Earth. They're the most fearless, cunning bunch I've ever seen. They would make a Kishtar warrior tremble in his fur. What kind of lawyers did you find? Falser asked. We've hired 6 from a top-notch medical malpractice firm. They said this negotiation would be a piece of cake, Jasper replied, just as the meeting room's doorbell rang. He pushed a button on the table's console, and the door opened, revealing one of the lawyers holding a thick pile of papers. Can we help you? Jasper asked. Sir, we have identified 25 spaceship code breaches on the CFS Juno. This place is a death trap, and these issues put the crew in grave danger, making their workspace much more hazardous than it should be. With your authorization and signature here, he pointed to the bottom of the last page. We will send a letter of formal notice to fleet headquarters. You guys will get a substantial pay raise when they settle. And by the way, the lawyer added, my name is Gus Scorched. As Nathaniel fumbled with the coffee machine, looking completely horrified, James saw the terror in his eyes. He laughed heartily, signed the document with a flourish, and glanced at Nathaniel with a smug grin. Told you these lawyers were the absolute best. Later that day, the legal team of the Happy System colony arrived on the CFS Juno. Lawyers from the team assembled on either side of a long wooden table in the ship's largest meeting room. They then engaged in a marathon debate lasting 12 hours straight, occasionally escalating to shouting matches and throwing glasses of water or fountain pens at each other. The power struggle was intense, showcasing their professional ferocity. Nathaniel, overwhelmed, retreated to his cabin and turned off his communication device. Act 3. Showtime. The day of the ceremony had finally arrived. James and Nathaniel stood in the ship's observation lounge, enjoying a breathtaking view of the planet below. Among the dignitaries present were the colony's CEO, Charlotte, her husband, their children, and their genetically engineered Pokemon pets. One of the Pikachu's high-fived a child, creating sparks with its tail. Some dignitaries wore traditional Earth clothes, while others donned medieval garb. One by one, they signed the final tripartite treaty. Charlotte delivered an inspiring speech, which was broadcast to the local colony and across the Galactic Union's worlds via faster-than-light communication channels. And thus, with this contract, we gain exclusive movie rights and product exclusivity on any newly discovered non-sentient creatures in the human and Carrie sectors of the galaxy. Nathaniel, unsure if his universal translator was functioning correctly, whispered to James, "I don't understand this last bit. What are they talking about?" James whispered back, "Their corporation has been securing lucrative deals for over a century, acquiring rights to everything from old folk tales to science fiction adventures. They sign contracts, not treaties." Nathaniel was still puzzled. "What? How? What the? Just shut up and listen. I'll explain later. Your universal translator wouldn't grasp the difference. It's all fine." Outside the spaceship, they saw an oddly designed, saucer-shaped but highly asymmetrical fighter ship emerge from the planet's dark side. 3 minutes later, the ship passed close to the observation lounge's bay window, eliciting gasps and exclamations of awe from the crowd. The ship had powerful plasma engines, but struggled to maintain stability, with cold gas thrusters firing in all directions to keep it from flipping over. Nathaniel looked even more confused. Why would they build such an inefficient ship? This has to be the slowest, least maneuverable ship in the whole galaxy. He looked up the ship's name on his tablet. It was something like "thousand-year-old bird with claws." The ship didn't resemble a bird at all. There weren't even feathers painted on its silvery gray hull. Then, 5 smaller fighter ships appeared from another corner of the bay window and started firing plasma bolts at the saucer-shaped ship. The ship easily dodged the plasma trails and fired back, causing 3 of the globe-shaped ships to explode. The 2 remaining ships retreated to the planet's surface. Before Nathaniel could say anything, James explained, "The small ones are drone ships. They're reenacting a mythical space battle just for our entertainment." James began cheering and clapping as more globe-shaped ships with bizarrely perpendicular winglets took off and engaged the saucer-shaped ship. The show was spectacular, with colorful plasma bolts, lasers, and torpedoes hitting targets and blowing up drone ships. The saucer-shaped ship then docked with the CFS Juno. As the highest-ranking representatives of the United Nations and the Kishtar fleet, James and Nathaniel were brought ahead of the group to meet the saucer ship's pilot. The airlock door opened, revealing a stunningly beautiful woman with braided blonde hair, wearing a Renaissance blue dress. A miniature horse trotted happily by her side. She bowed to the 2 ambassadors and said, "Hi, I am Major Aurora of the Disney Space Force. Welcome to the Happy Dwarf system. Please step into the Millennium Falcon, and I will fly you to our planet's capital, Magic Kingdom."